Augusta County Sheriff Donald Smith is under fire for an anonymous video that briefly appeared online Thursday. The video alleges that Sheriff Smith misled and lied to federal investigators while they were investigating a human trafficking case that one of Sheriff Smith's friends, by his own admission, Alex Chujoy, was eventually convicted of. After Sheriff Smith released a public statement in response to the video on the Augusta County Sheriff's Office's official Facebook page. I have watched the video in its entirety. I did not want to jump to conclusions, so I decided to obtain the actual documents that the video was based on in their entirety. I want our viewers to know that the documents I obtained are federal court records, affidavits by federal agents, excerpts from transcripts in the case, as well as federal judge Michael Urbanski's memorandum. My investigation into the video is detailed and thorough. That video will automatically play uninterrupted at the conclusion of my report. After obtaining all of the documents, it became very clear to me that the documents poke some enormous holes in Sheriff Smith's statement from yesterday. The documents also raise questions as to what was Sheriff Smith's real relationship with Felix Chujoy. Were they just good friends, as the sheriff claims, or were they more than friends? According to the documents, at least one federal prosecutor also questioned their relationship, to the point that she asked why his first instinct as a law enforcement officer was to call the defendant and not the government. Now, before I go into the details of the statement and the relationship, I want to make it clear, I don't enjoy prying into or raising questions about one's private life. But when it involves grand juries, U.S. attorneys, federal agents, and a human trafficking case, and the sheriff of Augusta County, these are questions I have to ask. In the sheriff's statement, he says, quote, "I was never given all of the details of the investigation from the investigator or the U.S. Attorney's Office, but I did meet with them and provided them the information I knew. I never obstructed justice, lied to investigators, or attempted to interfere with the investigation," end quote. Several documents dispute Smith's claim. Let's start with the first one. This is the affidavit of Special Agent Tammy Ketchum, filed in the United States District Court for the Western District of Virginia, court number 5:14-CR-00055. On page 2 of the document, Special Agent Ketchum says she and Special Agent David Liu interviewed then Deputy Donald Smith on May 27th of 2015. On page 3, Ketchum says prior to the June 2015 trial date of Felix Chujoy, she contacted Smith and asked him if he would meet with Assistant U.S. Attorney Carlton so they could prepare for trial, and that Smith refused to meet with the United States Attorney, despite the fact that he was subpoenaed to testify at the trial. That's right, refused is the key word here. Does that sound like Smith fully cooperated, as his statement says? Also on page 3, it states that Chujoy was incarcerated at the time and was using other inmates' PIN numbers to make calls undetected. On page 4 of the same document, it states that 11 calls made by Chujoy were recovered by the Rockingham County Jail and turned over to federal agents. The agents said 9 of the 11 covert calls were made to Donald Smith. In one of the calls on May 29th, 2015, Smith tells Chujoy, quote, "They came after me this week," end quote. And in the same call, Smith relayed some of the content from his interview with federal agents to Felix Chujoy. The document goes on to detail each call, but the last page of the document states that Smith stated to investigators that he received one telephone call from Chujoy in March of 2015 about picking up his mail, but did not tell investigators about the other calls or letters between him and Chujoy at either of his interviews in May and June of 2015. That's just one document that proves Sheriff Smith did not tell the feds everything he knew. The other document that discredits Smith's statement is the 64-page transcript from November 24, 2015 motions hearing in front of Judge Urbanski. On page 23 and 24 of this transcript, U.S. Assistant Attorney Carlton says the following to the court, speaking of Donald Smith, quote, "We confronted him initially. He said he didn't have the conversations with the defendant. We confronted him, and then he said maybe it was one or two, and then he downplayed, in fact. We have the jail calls. We know what the content is when we are questioning Deputy Smith. So when we're asking, what were those calls? And he is omitting all of those calls and conversations that he had with the defendant, literally in the weeks right before our June trial date, about the defendant, telling him you need to tell them about your cell phone. You need to tell them about me using the cell phone. So when Deputy Smith sits in the grand jury and he doesn't talk about all that stuff with the defendant, when he talks about how when his first instinct as a law enforcement officer was to call the defendant and not the government, this is a witness, by the way, as we put in our brief, who refused to meet with us, has been reluctant to one of his subpoenas at one time. We are allowed to ask those questions. Why is he so eager to help the defendant and not the government? End quote. That's a very good question posed by Assistant U.S. Attorney Carlton. Why was Donald Smith so eager to help the convict Felix Chujoy and not the government? This was a motions hearing, and if we go back to page 18 of this transcript, the judge is upset that the prosecutor wants to ask Don Smith if he loves Chewjoy. But it's a valid question. Let's refer back to Special Agent Ketchum's report. Page 5 shows that during the calls between Chewjoy and Smith, Smith tells Chewjoy that he did not tell federal agents anything and that he did not say certain things. What exactly are those certain things? When Chewjoy was finally released in June of 2015, he went to Sheriff Smith's home to retrieve personal belongings. What were those personal belongings? And how did they end up in Smith's possession? During that same visit, court documents state that Sheriff Smith gave Chewjoy his mom's phone to borrow for a few days. But in Sheriff Smith's statement yesterday, he states that his mother gave Chewjoy the phone, once again putting Sheriff Smith at odds with federal investigators. Who loaned Chewjoy the phone, Sheriff? You or your mom? We now know that Chewjoy used that phone to tamper with witnesses. I emailed Sheriff Smith a list of questions prior to compiling this report that question all of these discrepancies and the depth of his relationship with Felix Chewjoy. Despite the fact that I am a member of the media and a constituent of the sheriff, he has not responded to my email at this time. And finally, maybe the most shocking statement in all of the court records I found was on pages 57 and 58 of the motions transcript, where well-known and respected Harrisonburg-based attorney Gene Hart had this to say, quote, Mr. Smith, Sheriff-elect Smith, if he is there and testifies, I'll be stunned. One of the things we certainly heard here today was the government finally articulating the fact that, I would submit, that they think he lied in the grand jury. I don't know why he is not indicted, but after hearing what Ms. Carlton said today, I'm even more stunned that he's not. End quote. I leave my viewers with this. Why would Sheriff Donald Smith go to such great lengths to protect human trafficker Felix Chewjoy instead of helping the U.S. government? Possibly putting his career on the line. In the Breaking Through newsroom, Theodore Whitelow, Breaking Through News.
On December 12, 2014, federal agents with Homeland Security executed search warrants on several homes and businesses located in Harrisonburg, Virginia in reference to human trafficking and other federal charges. As a result of these search warrants, indictments were obtained for Maria Alvarado, Gladys Chewjoy, and Felix Chewjoy for labor trafficking, otherwise known as human trafficking, and other federal charges. According to a March 2015 news release from the U.S. Attorney's Office, Alvarado and Chewjoy managed Inca's secret restaurant in Harrisonburg. As part of the alleged labor trafficking conspiracy, Alvarado made regular trips to Peru where she recruited victims to immigrate illegally to the United States for the purpose of working unlawfully at her restaurant. According to the indictment, Alvarado promised to help smuggle the victims into the United States, told victims they would be paid for working at the restaurant, and agreed to provide the victims a place to live in their basement. In exchange, the victims had to work for Alvarado and Chewjoy at the restaurant for 6 months to work off the debt owed for smuggling and housing the victims. The victims were paid approximately $450 per month, effectively resulting in an hourly wage of less than $1.50 per hour. Other documents unsealed at a previous court hearing reflect that Alvarado and Chewjoy controlled the victims through isolation, threats, and harassment. During the ongoing investigation, and based on witness statements and cell phone records, federal agents believe that Alvarado and Felix Chewjoy tampered with witnesses by borrowing cell phones of their friends, one of which was Sheriff Donald Smith, of the Augusta County Sheriff's Office. As a result, Felix Chewjoy bond was revoked in March or 2015 but was released 3 months later. According to an affidavit by one of the special agents involved in the case, Sheriff Donald Smith was interviewed on May 27, 2015, and then again on June 10, at which time he was served with a subpoena. Unknown to the agents at the time of the interviews, Sheriff Smith had been in close contact with inmate Chewjoy and in fact had received numerous calls and letters from inmate Chewjoy who was incarcerated at the Rockingham County Jail at the time. According to the affidavit, Sheriff Smith only admitted to one phone call that took place in March 2015 that was in reference to picking up Chewjoy's mail. Sheriff Smith failed to mention any other telephone calls, or any jail letters to or from inmate Chewjoy in either of his interviews with federal investigators. Those interviews took place during the time frame Smith was receiving calls from Chewjoy. In fact, one of the calls occurred just 2 days prior to Smith's June interview with federal agents. The agent also stated in the affidavit that Sheriff Donald Smith, of the Augusta County Sheriff's Office, refused to cooperate with the Assistant United States Attorney handling the case, and refused to meet in order to prepare for trial and aid in the prosecution of Chu Joy. That trial was later delayed. On August 25, 2015, special agents learned that Felix Chu Joy devised a scheme to use other inmates' PIN numbers in order to make outside calls without detection to law enforcement. During his incarceration from March to June 2015, investigation uncovered 11 calls were made by Chu Joy using other inmates' PIN numbers. Of the 11 calls, 9 calls were between Chu Joy and Sheriff Donald Smith of the Augusta County Sheriff's Office. These calls were recovered by the Rockingham County Jail and turned over to Homeland Security. On a call dated May 10, 2015, Smith agreed to pay the bills for Chu Joy. During the call, Chu Joy asked Smith if he had received a letter from him. According to the affidavit, the letter seemed to be asking advice on Chu Joy's criminal case. In another call that same month, Sheriff Smith tells Chu Joy that the feds came after him, and Chu Joy asked Smith what was said during his interview with federal investigators. Smith relayed some of the content of his interview with federal agents to inmate Chu Joy. Chu Joy then informs the sheriff that he will write him, but for Smith not to write back. On June 2, 2015, Chu Joy again contacts Sheriff Smith via his covert PIN number on the prison phone system. During that call, inmate Chu Joy tells Smith that Mike is the reason federal agents called Smith and that he wanted the sheriff to know that. Mike is Mike Kwiatkowski, who was friends with Chu Joy but who also spoke with federal agents. Chu Joy was attempting to use Smith as well as other people to influence Mike's statements to the federal agents. 3 days later, Chu Joy calls Sheriff Smith again, and asked if he received his letter, which Smith confirmed that he had, but indicated that he did not get the letter about Mike. Smith asked if he needed to go talk to Mike, and Chu Joy indicated, only after you receive my letter about Mike. During this conversation, according to the affidavit, Chu Joy seemed surprised that Smith talked with federal agents because Smith had told him he was not going to talk. Smith said he did not tell them anything and that he did not say certain things. On June 8, 2015, Chu Joy again called Sheriff Smith and wanted to know if he had heard anything and instructed Smith to contact another person on his behalf. This was just 2 days before Sheriff Smith was interviewed again by federal agents. Sheriff Smith continued to receive 4 more calls from Chu Joy until Chu Joy's release in late June of 2015. Upon his release, Chu Joy goes to Sheriff Smith's house to retrieve personal items from Smith and for Smith to let Chu Joy use his father's phone. According to sworn testimony given by Sheriff Smith in December of 2015, Sheriff Smith testified that Chu Joy was using one of his father's phone. But when Sheriff Smith testified in 2017 at a retrial of this case, a newspaper article dated February 2, 2017, reported that Chu Joy showed up to Sheriff Smith's home following his arrest and asked to borrow a cell phone, to which Sheriff Smith gave Chu Joy his mother's cell phone for several days. While in possession of Mrs. Smith's cell phone, it was used in an attempt to influence witness testimony. The covert jailhouse calls from inmate Chu Joy, interviews with federal agents, and letting Chu Joy use either his father's or mother's cell phone in order to make covert calls to witnesses all took place during the same time period Deputy Smith was running for office. While Sheriff Smith was never charged in this case, that didn't keep the Assistant U.S. Attorney or Mr. Hart from raising serious questions in court about Sheriff Smith. In one statement, Mr. Hart states to the court that, "One of the things we certainly heard here today was the government finally articulating the fact that, I would submit, that they think he, meaning Sheriff Smith, lied in the grand jury. I don't know why he is not indicted. But after hearing what Ms. Carlton said today, I'm even more stunned that he's not."